In a small, quiet forest by the edge of a tall, towering mountain, there lived a small sparrow named Pip. He was a little bird with soft brown feathers, bright eyes, and a small beak that often chirped happily. Pip was known far and wide for his kind heart and bravery, even though he was the tiniest of creatures in the entire forest. Pip was a very curious bird. He loved to fly high into the air, looking at the world below him. He explored every corner of the forest, hopping from branch to branch and playing in the cool shade of the trees. He would visit the rabbits and squirrels, always helping them collect food or making sure the younger animals were safe. Pip was small, but he never felt that being small was a problem. He believed that being kind and brave was what truly mattered. However, there was one problem in the forest. Deep in the heart of the mountain, there was a cave, and in that cave lived Moss, a giant. Moss was enormous. His body was as large as the biggest tree in the forest. He had thick green fur that covered his arms and legs, and his huge hands could break branches with a single touch. His eyes were as big as plates, and his voice was deep and heavy, like thunder. The animals of the forest had heard Moss's loud footsteps at night, but they had never seen him. They only saw broken trees and large footprints near the cave. The animals were frightened by these signs, and they whispered about the giant in the forest. "Moss is dangerous," they said. "He is so big. He could crush us." As the rumors spread, more and more animals started leaving the forest. The rabbits, the birds, and the deer all began to move away. They couldn't stay in a place where a giant lived, even though they had never seen him. Pip, however, wasn't afraid. He was sad to see his friends leave, but he didn't believe that Moss was dangerous. "I think Moss is lonely," Pip thought to himself. "Maybe he just needs a friend." One day, Pip decided that he would find out more about Moss. He wanted to be sure that the giant wasn't as scary as everyone thought. He had a plan. "I will go to Moss's cave and show him that we aren't afraid of him," Pip said. "Maybe he will come out and talk to me." And so, Pip flew off to the mountain, determined to learn the truth. The mountain was tall and covered with thick trees. It was a long journey, but Pip was not afraid. He flew high above the forest, looking down at the trees below him. The wind carried him gently through the air, and soon he reached the base of the mountain. There he saw Moss's cave, a dark hole in the side of the rock, hidden deep within the mountain. Pip sat on a nearby branch, looking at the cave. "I need to show Moss that we aren't afraid of him," he said to himself, "but I don't want to scare him." Pip thought for a while, then had an idea. he would bring gifts to Moss, small, thoughtful gifts that would show the giant that the animals of the forest meant no harm. "I'll start by bringing some berries and flowers," Pip decided. He flew back into the forest, gathering the best berries he could find. He picked some small, colorful flowers and collected a few soft leaves. Once he had everything he needed, Pip flew back to the cave. He carefully placed the gifts just outside the entrance and quickly flew away to hide behind a nearby tree. He wanted Moss to find the gifts, but not see him. For several days, Pip continued to bring small gifts to Moss. Each day, he flew back to the cave and left more berries, flowers, and leaves. He always made sure to fly away quickly so Moss wouldn't see him. Pip hoped that Moss would begin to notice the gifts and realize that the animals didn't mean any harm. But after a few days, Pip started to wonder. "Does Moss even know I'm leaving these gifts?" he thought. "Maybe he's not even looking." Then, one morning, as Pip was leaving another pile of berries, he heard a sound behind him. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. Pip turned around, and there, just outside the cave, was Moss. The giant's big eyes were watching him curiously. Pip froze. He was nervous, but he didn't want to fly away. Instead, he took a deep breath and said softly, "Hello, Moss." Moss blinked. He was so big that it took him a moment to look down at the tiny sparrow. His voice was deep and slow when he spoke. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Pip smiled, trying to sound calm. "I brought you some gifts," he said. "Berries, flowers, and leaves. I thought you might like them." Moss looked at the gifts and then back at Pip. His big eyes were full of confusion. "Why are you giving me gifts?" Moss asked. Pip took a step forward and said, "I wanted to show you that we're not afraid of you. I think you're lonely, and I wanted to be your friend." Moss stood still for a long time. He had never heard anyone speak to him like this before. Most animals ran away from him, afraid of his size. Moss didn't know how to respond, but something in Pip's voice made him feel safe. Finally, Moss nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't know anyone cared." Pip smiled. "Of course we care. Everyone needs a friend." Over the next few days, Pip continued to visit Moss. He would bring gifts, and sometimes he would simply sit outside the cave and talk. Moss was still shy, but he slowly began to feel more comfortable with Pip. Each day, Pip would tell him stories about the forest, the animals, the trees, the rivers, and the flowers. Moss loved to listen to Pip's stories, and soon he began to share his own. Moss told Pip about his life in the mountain. He had lived there alone for many years, with no one to talk to. The animals had always been afraid of him, and Moss had never been able to make friends. But now, thanks to Pip's kindness, he was starting to feel different. One day, as Pip sat on a branch near the cave, he asked Moss, "Would you like to come visit the forest with me? The other animals will be happy to meet you. I know they'll see that you're not scary." Moss was unsure at first. He had never left the mountain before. "I don't know, Pip," Moss said. "What if they don't like me?" Pip chirped encouragingly. "Don't worry, I'll be with you. We can go slowly, and I'll introduce you to everyone. I know they'll like you, Moss." Moss thought for a moment. He trusted Pip and wanted to make new friends. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll come with you." And so, the next morning, Pip and Moss set out for the forest together. It was a long journey, but Pip stayed close to Moss, guiding him through the trees. They moved slowly, but with each step, Moss grew more confident. The animals in the forest watched from a distance, surprised to see the giant walking through the trees. When they reached the heart of the forest, Pip introduced Moss to the animals. At first, they were all a little scared. But when they saw how gentle Moss was with Pip, they began to relax. One evening, a big storm rolled in. The wind howled, and the rain fell in sheets. The animals of the forest scrambled to find shelter, but Pip was caught outside. The wind was too strong, and Pip couldn't fly. He called out for help, but the storm was so loud, no one could hear him. Moss, who had been watching from his cave, heard Pip's cries over the roar of the wind. Without a second thought, he ran down the mountain. The wind and rain pelted against his fur, but he didn't stop. When he reached Pip, he carefully scooped the small bird up in his big hands, protecting him from the storm. Pip looked up in surprise. "Moss, you saved me," he said. Moss smiled, his deep voice full of warmth. "I will always protect you, Pip." The other animals watched from their shelters, seeing for the first time that Moss wasn't scary. He was kind and protective, and he had saved Pip from the storm. After the storm passed, the animals came out of their shelters and saw Moss standing with Pip. They gathered around, and Pip spoke to them. "Moss is not a scary giant. He's our friend. He protected me during the storm, and he has a kind heart." The animals slowly began to trust Moss. They saw that he wasn't dangerous and that he had been misunderstood for so long. Moss, the giant, had a gentle soul, and the animals learned that true strength didn't come from size or power. It came from kindness and courage. From that day on, Moss visited the forest often. He and Pip became best friends, and the animals of the forest learned not to judge someone by their size. They saw that everyone had something valuable to offer, and Moss's friendship brought a new feeling of peace to the forest. And so, the moral of the story spread through the trees. True strength comes from understanding, kindness, and the courage to be a friend.